Last week, Matthew ended chapter 9 with crowds bringing the sick to Jesus, and everyone who touched even the hem of his garment was healed. And then chapter 15 begins. After that, a group of Pharisees and religion scholars came all the way from Jerusalem to ask, "Why do your disciples play so fast and loose with the rules?" So you think about that. While ordinary people had been bringing Jesus those who needed healing, while that's going on, religious authorities were walking more than 100 dusty miles from Jerusalem to bring him a complaint. And what was that important? His disciples weren't washing their hands before they ate. Now, this isn't about hygiene or good manners. It's about a religious practice intended to honor God's holiness, but it had become a way of deciding who was doing religion correctly. A way to dismiss people who were not observant enough or who weren't clean enough. While Jesus keeps asking, who needs mercy? They keep asking and judging, who's doing religion right? And of course, what is right if it doesn't involve mercy? That's what Jesus has been saying over and over. And then you notice we skip from 1 to 2 to 10 to 11 because there's this long, extended discussion about eating and what happens after eating, involving way too much information. I mean, seriously, it's TMI. And then after that, Jesus and his disciples leave the religious leaders behind. And they leave Jewish territory, and they head about 50 miles toward the Mediterranean coast. And they enter into Gentile country. Matthew tells the story of a Canaanite woman who came down from the hills to meet Jesus. Now, curiously, he didn't call her a Gentile woman, which is the typical term for that time. No, Matthew, in telling his story, reaches all the way back to a name associated with Israel's ancient enemies. And the listeners' would have heard that, and their ears perked up. She came to Jesus and she pleaded, "Master, Son of David, have mercy. My daughter is afflicted by a cruel, evil spirit." And so you notice that this Gentile/Canaanite woman called him Son of David, which is odd because that's Israel's title for the Messiah. Why would she say that? Yet, whether it's an honorific title or not, the disciples didn't care. They complained, "She's bothering us. Tell her to go away." Because they see an interruption, not a desperate mother. And Jesus doesn't even answer her. Not a word. And finally he says, "I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel," which basically sounds like, "I'm not here for the likes of you." Now, if we're honest, Jesus comes across as a little bit of a jerk here. And it feels completely at odds with everything we have watched Jesus do now for 14 chapters. But it only gets worse. So the woman drops to her knees and begs, "Master, help me." And we know that Jesus is always talking about mercy, right? But he didn't relent. He said, "It's not right to take bread out of children's mouths and throw it to dogs." But she didn't flinch at the insult. Instead, she refused to be dismissed. She came back quickly. "You're right, Master. But at least dogs get scraps from the master's table." And Jesus stopped and looked at her and said, "Woman, you have great faith. What you ask for, you will get." And her daughter, right then, became well. Now, if those religious authorities from Jerusalem had been there to witness this encounter, you can almost picture them nodding their heads vigorously and elbowing one another. Finally, he's come to his senses. That is, up until that very last sentence. Matthew has turned everything upside down. Jesus makes a point of praising this particular, unexpected woman for her faith, a woman who refused to be dismissed or dissuaded or deterred for the sake of her child. And she makes me think of Mamie Till Mobley. It's Emmett Till's mother. In the summer of 1955, Mamie allowed her 14-year-old son to take the train from Chicago to Mississippi to visit relatives. And he'd never been in the South before, and she tried to warn him, but he had too cheerful a spirit. Just look at his face. He couldn't believe that, wouldn't listen, that anybody would want to harm him. But it didn't take long for the deadly realities of Jim Crow to find him. And he was accused of offending a white woman in a country store. Some say he whistled, some say he spoke out of turn, but in the end, the details don't matter, because false or exaggerated accusations like these had been used for generations to justify racial terror. And so Emmett was kidnapped in the middle of the night. He was tortured beyond recognition, murdered, and thrown into the Tallahatchie River, where his body remained underwater for days. And after he was discovered, Mississippi authorities wanted him buried right then and there, quickly, quietly. And Mamie refused. She brought her son home to Chicago and then made a decision that would help change the course of American history. She insisted on an open casket. And many begged her not to do it. He was too disfigured. No mother should have to look at her child that way. No one else should have to see it either. But Mamie understood something. Black Americans had lived with racial terror for generations. They did not need photographs of his body in a coffin to know what false accusations become. But white America needed to see it. And Mamie's determination was clear. Let the people see what I have seen. More than 100,000 people passed by Emmett's coffin. Millions across the country saw the photographs. She refused to let what people had done to him and countless others go unseen. She refused to let her son's life be explained away as just another tragedy. You know, history remembers Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat. We should also remember that just 3 months earlier, Mamie Till Mobley refused to close her son's casket. She would not be dismissed. And the Gospels are full of parents like this. Jairus, who was a leader of the local synagogue, throws himself at the feet of Jesus because his little girl is dying. An official from the court of King Herod himself walked 20 miles to beg for his son. There's another father who brings his son to Jesus, and years of heartbreak have taught him how dangerous hope can be. But he came anyway on behalf of his son, and he tells Jesus, I believe. Help my unbelief. It's one of the best prayers in the whole Bible. Help my unbelief. And these are different circumstances and different children, but with the same resolve. And each time, whether they were peasants or government officials or religious figures, Jesus responds. Which only deepens the mystery of why not the Canaanite woman? I mean, why does this unfold so differently? And there's lots of theories, but it remains one of the great mysteries of the Gospels. And yet, whatever it was that was happening in that moment between the two of them, Matthew is unmistakably clear about how it ends. A Canaanite woman who refused to be dismissed is praised. Great is your faith. And to this day, we can recognize her in every parent who won't stop fighting for their child, or foster parents, or grandparents, or just anyone who steps in to parent when others can't, making it work as they wonder how they will pay for this week's groceries, and fighting for the services their child needs, or waiting as long as needed outside juvenile detention, or crossing a border to give their children a better life. Spending years advocating and appealing and explaining and hoping and praying. But this isn't just about children, is it? Sometimes it's about your husband or about your wife. Years of advocating and appealing and explaining and hoping and praying, or maybe for your parents or for a dear friend. But that is because this is what love does, right? Discouraged or not, love fills out another form anyway. And disappointed or not, love makes another phone call anyway. And exhausted or not, love sits through another appointment anyway. And it is the great cost of love. And that's the I believe, but help my unbelief kind of faith. A love that refuses to be dismissed. And I've always appreciated the trust of that Father. Nothing dramatic, nothing certain, just a faith that refuses to quit on someone. And I wonder how many of you are carrying that kind of faith right now. You know, overwhelmed by it all, by grief or fear or exhaustion, and wondering what to do. And maybe all you need today is to recognize this. That is faith. Courage to keep loving. The courage to keep going. The courage to persist through disappointment after disappointment. Because you say, with courage, I refuse to be dismissed. And you know, Jesus has a name for that. What's he call it? Great faith.